He walked into the pharmacy like he always did. No one paid attention until a young Navy SEAL froze, his entire body rigid. Slowly he stepped forward, eyes locked, breath caught, and then he whispered, "Sir, Ghost 5?" The entire pharmacy went silent. The old man didn't answer. He simply lowered his head, like a mountain that once endured lightning, now worn down to cold, unmoving stone. But in that quiet moment, something buried began to stir. A name that wasn't supposed to exist. A unit erased from records. And a story the world was never meant to hear. Until now. It was a Thursday afternoon in a quiet town that rarely changed. The local pharmacy sat on the corner of Main and Jefferson, nestled between a faded laundromat and a diner with more memories than customers. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow over rows of painkillers, cough syrup, and vitamins for joints that no longer bent as easily. The receipt printer ticked out paper like clockwork, and the pharmacist behind the counter made light conversation with a customer about insurance copays. It was the kind of place where time moved a little slower, and no one minded. Then the door opened with a soft chime. An elderly man stepped in. He wore a weathered gray jacket, the collar slightly frayed, and a faded baseball cap pulled low over a brow lined with age. His posture was slightly hunched, not from weakness, but from the slow weight of decades. His right hand trembled slightly as he let the door close behind him. No one turned to look. To the staff, he was just another regular, one of many elderly folks who came in to refill prescriptions and perhaps say a few words before retreating into silence. The cashier smiled at him politely. He nodded in return and continued walking, his boots making a soft, deliberate shuffle against the linoleum. But someone noticed. At the far end of the store, near the cough syrup aisle, a young man stood still. He wore a plain t-shirt tucked into camouflage pants, a military-style rucksack slung over one shoulder. He looked like someone home on leave, just another soldier buying medication for a parent or grandparent. In fact, he was holding a prescription in his hand, reading it absently. Then his eyes lifted and locked. The moment his gaze met the old man's profile, the air shifted. His grip loosened. The bottle slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud, the plastic bouncing once before rolling under the shelf. But the man didn't reach down. He didn't move. He stared, unblinking, unmoving. Something inside him had frozen, as if the world around him had suddenly gone silent. Slowly, deliberately, he took one step forward, then another. Each movement was careful, almost reverent. He wasn't walking toward a stranger. He was approaching a presence, a memory, a story told in whispers across a barracks in firelight, buried beneath layers of black ink and redacted names. He came to a stop just 2 feet from the old man, stood tall, raised his chin, and with a voice so low only the two of them could hear, he spoke. "Sir, Ghost 5?" It wasn't a question. It was recognition, a name not spoken aloud in over 2 decades. The old man stopped mid-step. He didn't look surprised. He didn't flinch. His head tilted just slightly toward the voice, like an old wolf sniffing wind from long ago. For a heartbeat, no one in the store spoke. A woman turned from the vitamin aisle, blinking at the sudden stillness. The cashier paused mid-scan, the beeping register halting in suspense. But the 2 men remained motionless. The soldier stood frozen in position, his eyes now brimming with something between awe and guilt. The old man didn't answer, didn't acknowledge the name. He just stared ahead, his jaw clenched faintly. Then, almost imperceptibly, he lowered his head, not in shame, not in pain, but in something deeper. He looked ancient, like a mountain that had once survived the storm and now simply endured. And then, without a word, he turned, walked toward the back of the store, past the aisles, past the checkout. The younger man didn't follow. He simply stood there, breathing like he had just stepped out of a memory that wasn't his to begin with. The moment hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight, silent, suspended, waiting to settle. The young Navy SEAL stood stiff, unmoving, still staring at the back of the old man, who now continued toward the counter with slow, deliberate steps. He had spoken the name, Ghost 5, A name that was never supposed to be said out loud. A name erased from the briefings, the official documents, the world's memory. But the old man gave no reaction, no acknowledgement, no emotion. He reached the counter, pulled a folded prescription from his jacket pocket, and slid it silently toward the pharmacist. She looked up, clearly sensing the tension in the room, her hand hesitating just a second before taking the slip. Behind him, the young soldier finally found his voice again. "Sir, please, don't walk away." The old man didn't turn. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Not shaking now, his hands were steady, purposeful. He counted out the cash with the precision of someone who still remembered how to field strip a rifle in the dark. "I was trained on a copy of your signature," the SEAL said, louder this time. "In my unit, we called you the Silent Legend." That made a few heads turn. A customer near the cold remedies aisle raised an eyebrow. The pharmacist paused again, her hands freezing over the keyboard. Still, the old man didn't respond. He placed the exact change on the counter. "Sir, please. Ghost 5 was the reason I joined." The old man picked up the paper bag of medication, folded it neatly under one arm. Then he finally spoke, quietly without looking back. "You've got the wrong man." His voice was gravel and winter. Just 5 words. 5 words sharp enough to cut through the myth that had just been reborn. "No, sir," the SEAL insisted, his voice trembling. "I've studied your file, what little we had access to. I've seen that mission report from '96, the last known appearance before your unit vanished." That was when the old man turned. Not all the way, just enough for the younger man to see his profile. The scar that ran just behind his right ear, the hardened line of his jaw. And something else, a look that said he'd lived through things no one should carry, and chose silence over storytelling. "You want a ghost?" the man said, voice lower now. "Find another. Show." Then he turned and walked away, the bag of medicine clutched in his left hand, the right hand briefly brushing the brim of his hat in what could almost have been a salute or a farewell. The automatic door hissed open as he exited. The SEAL hesitated, his fists clenched. For a second, he considered letting it go, letting the myth remain a myth. But something in him refused to accept the silence. He rushed out after him. Exterior, pharmacy parking lot, late afternoon. The air outside was sharp with early autumn. The wind stirred fallen leaves around the asphalt like whispers chasing each other. The old man walked with purpose, toward an old pickup truck at the edge of the lot. "Sir," the SEAL called out. The man didn't slow. "Just 5 minutes," the SEAL pleaded. "I'm not here to expose anything. I just need to know if what they taught us was real. If you were real." The man reached the truck, unlocked it with a key, opened the driver's door. "Please," the SEAL added, "you're the reason my father re-enlisted. He said you pulled him out of a minefield in '88. He never talked about it until the day he died. He called you a ghost, too." The old man stopped, his back to the SEAL, one hand resting on the edge of the open door, the other clenched tightly around the bag of medicine. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, like a monument worn by storms and silence. Then slowly he got in, closed the door, started the engine, and drove away. The base was quiet that night. Rain tapped steadily against the barracks windows, and the usual sound of laughter from the rec room had dulled to silence. Most of the team had turned in early. Only one man sat awake in the dimly lit operations room, his fingers resting on the edge of a mug gone cold hours ago. The young SEAL stepped inside. His boots were still damp from the walk across the tarmac, and his eyes hadn't settled since the pharmacy. Across the room, seated behind the cluttered desk, was Commander Will Garrett, an older man with a face like carved stone and shoulders that still carried a battlefield's worth of weight. Garrett looked up. The two locked eyes. "I need to ask you something," the SEAL said quietly, "about Ghost 5. For a moment, Garrett didn't blink. Then slowly he set the mug down. Leaning back in his chair, he exhaled a long breath, like the air had been trapped inside his chest for decades. "You saw him?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir. I think I did." Another pause. Then Garrett looked down at the scar on his wrist, the one he never explained, and shook his head almost in disbelief. No one's seen him in almost 30 years, he muttered. The last man who claimed to speak with him died 6 months later. Heart failure. They found a shredded photo of Ghost Unit tucked inside his boot. No one could identify anyone in it. But I knew. I knew. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. Opening it, he turned to a page marked only with a number. 13G. They called us Ghost Unit 13 back then. That's not the real designation, of course. That one never made it to paper. The real name was never logged. Because, officially, we didn't exist. The young SEAL leaned forward. Garrett's eyes were far away now, not lost in memory, but buried in it. Unit 13 Ghost was handpicked in the early 80s, smallest spec ops team ever formed. 7 men, 1 woman. Every one of them fluent in multiple languages, expert in survival, infiltration, and erasure. We weren't just meant to complete missions. We were meant to erase evidence that those missions ever occurred. We called him Ghost 5 because of his number in the unit, but truthfully, he led us all, not by rank, by silence. He was the kind of man who never yelled. He didn't need to. You knew you were alive because he said so. Flashback Operation Dark Hour, 1996. In a desolate canyon on the edge of a war-torn nation, 7 figures moved through moonless blackness like they were born in shadow. No radios, no lights, no backup. Only code signals, hand gestures, foot taps, 2 glances in the dark. That was how Ghost 5 operated. Their mission that night? Erase an enemy communications array buried deep in a supposedly neutral zone. The kind of operation no government could admit to. One failure, and the headlines would write themselves in lies. But they succeeded. Clean. No alarms. No survivors. They were gone before sunrise. Except something happened. Something Ghost 5 never spoke of. Only the aftermath was known. The unit disbanded within weeks. Official records were shredded. All 8 members were declared inactive, retired, or reassigned. No medals, no funerals. And Ghost 5? He disappeared. Not discharged, not retired, just gone. Back to present, base ops room. The commander closed the journal slowly. There are theories, he said. Some think he went rogue. Others think he was ordered to vanish because he knew too much. But I think... He paused, then looked straight at the young SEAL. I think Ghost 5 chose to disappear, to bury the past with him, not out of guilt, but out of mercy, for us, for the country, for what we had to do. The room was silent again. The SEAL's voice was tight. He looked ordinary, worn, but his eyes, sir, he looked at me like he knew I'd come, like he'd already forgiven me for asking. Garrett nodded slowly. That's him. That's Ghost 5. He stood up, placing the old journal into the younger man's hands. You've seen a piece of history no one else is supposed to remember, and now it's your weight to carry. The house stood at the edge of town, where the pavement turned to gravel, and the streetlights stopped trying. Modest square, a small porch with peeling paint, a rusted mailbox that hadn't held a real letter in years. Inside it was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't just mean silence, but memory. The walls bore the dull yellow tint of age, and the furniture, well kept but plainly worn, spoke of a man who didn't want more than he needed. The living room was lined with photographs, dozens of them, some in frames, others taped to the wall. All black and white, faces blurred, backgrounds faded. Many of the photos had been clipped, cropped, or marked. In some, heads were turned away. In others, they were simply missing, faces scratched out or never captured by the lens. It was as if the man had tried to preserve memories while still hiding them from the world, from himself. Each morning just after sunrise, he left the house on foot, always the same route, down Lincoln Street, past the shuttered hardware store, left on Washington, then 2 blocks west, past the school no longer in use. He never carried a phone, never wore earbuds, just the gray cap, the same jacket, and a small thermos of black coffee in his hand. Most mornings no one greeted him. The occasional jogger might nod politely, but they rarely got one back. Only one person spoke to him with any regularity. Mrs. Delaney, the elderly widow 2 houses down. Her legs were failing. Her husband had passed 5 years prior, and her radio, the only one that played the old swing stations she loved, hadn't worked in months. He fixed it. No words. Just appeared one morning, knocked gently and said, "I heard you had a radio problem." That was the longest sentence he ever spoke to her. She told her daughter later, he had the hands of someone who used to disarm bombs. Back at home, he spent most of his time at the small workbench in the garage. It wasn't filled with modern tools, no power drills, no laser guides, just old soldering irons, tiny screwdrivers, and a tangle of circuit boards and radio parts, some dating back to the Cold War. He repaired things that no one used anymore, things that only seemed to make sense to people who remembered the world before satellites and glass phones. He didn't sell them. He didn't gift them. He just fixed them, and then set them aside, each one quietly humming on a dusty shelf like ghosts lined up for roll call. But the strangest thing, the thing no one ever truly noticed, was the wall. On his walk, he always stopped at a stretch of old red brick, overgrown with ivy, hidden between 2 abandoned buildings behind a former grocery store. Nothing marked the wall, no plaque, no graffiti, no history, just bricks laid by someone long forgotten. And yet, he always stopped there. Every single day, he'd pause, sip his coffee, then for about 1 minute, just stand still. Sometimes he'd reach out and place his palm against one particular brick, always the same one. No one asked him why, and perhaps no one dared to. But if they had, and if he'd chosen to answer, he might have said, "Because some things don't deserve a headstone, they deserve to stay hidden, right where we left them." From the outside, he was just another old man in a quiet town. Polite, quiet, invisible. But beneath the dust of routine and the layers of ordinary, he was still waiting, still remembering, still guarding a secret that history had tried and failed to forget. The autumn wind was sharp that morning. Leaves skittered across the cracked sidewalk outside the pharmacy as the elderly man stepped out, his brown paper bag of heart medication tucked carefully under one arm. He adjusted the brim of his cap against the light and began his usual walk, slow, deliberate, unchanged for years. But this time, he wasn't alone. 2 men waited at the edge of the sidewalk, just past the rusted bench where he always paused. One was young, recognizably the same Navy SEAL from before. His posture stiffened the moment the old man approached. The other was older, with silver hair cropped to regulation, his uniform neat but faded by time. The ribbons on his chest were real, the eyes behind them, even more so. "Sir," the young SEAL said, voice soft but certain. The old man stopped mid-step. His eyes moved from the younger to the elder. The older officer spoke next. "Colonel Davis, retired, 4th Reconnaissance. You commanded my extraction in Kandahar, 1989. You ordered us to leave you behind, but we didn't." The silence between them was thick, heavy with years and memory. Then the colonel reached into his coat. He pulled out a small, square object wrapped in black cloth. With a quiet reverence, he unfolded it, revealing a cold, gunmetal gray badge. An angular ghost insignia etched into stainless steel. Worn edges, no name, no number, just the mark of a unit that didn't exist. "We've been carrying this with us," the colonel said, waiting for the day we could return it. And then, without hesitation, both men dropped to one knee. They didn't salute. They didn't speak. They simply held the badge out with both hands, heads bowed, not to a superior officer, but to a man whose silence had held back history itself. The old man stared at the insignia for a long time. His lips trembled. His eyes flickered, not with fear, but with something long buried, breaking the surface. He took a single step back, then another, and finally sat down slowly on the edge of the bench. "I told them to burn every trace," he said, voice hoarse. "I told them not to let it follow me." No one spoke. "I didn't want a legacy. I wanted forgiveness." The young SEAL looked up, eyes wide. "Forgiveness? Sir, you're the reason any of us are alive today." The old man shook his head, just once. "No, I'm the reason 7 men vanished without honors. I'm the reason the last mission went dark." He looked down at his hands. They were trembling again, but not from age. There was a breach, he continued. We were deep in hostile territory. Someone on the inside, someone on the ground, compromised the team. I had a choice: evacuate and risk exposure of what we were doing, or activate Black Protocol. The colonel whispered, almost in disbelief. You gave the erasure order. The old man nodded slowly. I had to. Our presence would have sparked a global incident. I signed the authorization to wipe the entire team, including myself, from all records. I lived. They didn't. A long silence. The wind pushed a stray leaf across his boots. They called it the clean fade, he muttered. Erasure without explosion. Disappear without dying. The SEAL lowered his eyes. And yet, you never disappeared. Not really. The old man looked up. His gaze landed on the badge still cradled in the colonel's palms. Something cracked inside him. His lips parted, and a single tear slid down one weathered cheek. You kept it, he whispered. All these years. The colonel nodded. Because someone had to. You weren't a ghost to us, sir. You were the reason we kept going. You taught us that silence is a shield, and sometimes a sacrifice. The old man finally reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the steel. Then he pulled his hand back. I don't deserve it. You do, the SEAL said quietly. You always did. The old man looked up, straight into the eyes of the young soldier. What's your name? Petty Officer Thomas Blake, sir. Who was your father? Sergeant Alan Blake. The air shifted. Alan, the old man repeated, eyes narrowing. He said you dragged him out of a minefield in '88. Said you shouldn't have survived it. I didn't, the old man murmured. At least not all of me. Then he nodded slowly. He was a good man. Quiet. Steady. He named me after you, Blake said. Thomas, after your real name, the one he never told anyone. The old man's eyes dropped to the badge once more. This time he took it. His fingers curled around the steel as if absorbing a weight he had refused for far too long. He didn't wear it. He didn't speak. He just held it to his chest and closed his eyes. And for the first time in decades, he let himself be seen, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as a man who had made an impossible choice and never stopped living with it. It happened quietly. 1 week later, on a cold morning laced with low fog, the man they called Ghost 5 passed away in his sleep. There was no obituary, no formal notice, no military banner draped over his bed. Just a folded blanket, a cup of unfinished coffee, and the faint buzz of an old radio still playing static beside him. His will was simple. No ceremony, no speech, no honors. The town's small funeral home received his body without much fanfare. The director, used to empty rooms and silent pews, prepared a modest casket of polished pine. On the day of the funeral, only 3 people showed up. The pharmacist who had always smiled at him, Mrs. Delaney from 2 houses down, and Petty Officer Thomas Blake, now in full dress uniform. The chapel was almost too quiet. Outside, the wind rustled fallen leaves across the gravel parking lot. Inside, no choir sang. No one read scripture. The room felt suspended, like time itself held its breath. At 11:13 a.m., the back doors opened. No one had heard footsteps, no engines, no rustling of fabric. But they entered, 13 men, one by one, in perfect formation. They wore black military uniforms stripped of rank, insignia, or medals. No names, no patches, no identification, only silence. They took their positions with practiced ease, 6 on each side of the casket and 1 at the head. No commands were spoken, no glances exchanged. Then, as one, they snapped to attention. No salute was rushed. No motion was uncertain. Their hands raised slowly, steadily, an act not of ritual, but of reverence. Behind the casket, Blake stepped forward. In his hands was the same steel insignia, the ghost emblem worn smooth by time, now polished to a subtle sheen. He knelt, placed the badge atop the casket, just above where the old man's heart now lay still, then leaned in and whispered with a voice only the dead could hear, "Mission complete, sir." He held the pose for a long moment, and then rose. Outside the chapel, the 13 silent soldiers stood motionless. When the service ended, they didn't enter any vehicles. No convoy waited. No identification was taken. They simply disappeared down the street, on foot, fading into the morning mist. No one followed. No one dared. It was as if they had returned only to close a chapter they alone had permission to read. Later that night, back at the pharmacy, the manager stayed late. The lights were off except for the glow from the security monitors behind the counter. She sipped tea absent-mindedly, eyes drifting across screens showing aisle after aisle of stillness. Then she paused. She rewound one of the recordings. Camera 2, front entrance, back exactly 1 week. There he was, the old man, entering for the final time. Same gray coat, same slow walk. She watched him move through the door, nod to her from a distance, then shuffle down the pain relief aisle. No expression, no urgency, just presence. She let the footage roll again. He didn't speak to anyone. He bought only one item. When he turned to leave, he paused near the door, just for a second, and looked up at the camera, directly into it, as if he knew it would be watched later, as if he was saying goodbye. Not to her, not to the store, but to something much older, to a world that had asked too much of him, and a silence he had carried longer than anyone should. She sat back in the chair, tears slipping down her cheek without quite knowing why. She didn't know his real name, didn't know what he'd done or who he'd saved, but she knew something sacred had passed through that door, and now it was gone. The badge remained on the casket until burial. The only marker on his grave was a single line etched into simple gray stone. He never spoke of it, but he never walked away. Not every hero wants to be remembered. Some would rather fade into the noise of everyday life, quietly without ceremony, because the weight of what they carry isn't meant for spotlight or applause. Ghost 5 wasn't just a code name. He was a man who made impossible choices and then lived with them, without recognition, without complaint. And maybe that's the most American thing about him, doing the right thing even when no one's watching. In a time where everything is shared instantly, where attention seems louder than integrity, his life reminds us of something deeper. That duty is not for display. That sacrifice doesn't always come with medals. And that quiet dignity still has a place in this world. You see, today we honor loud success, but we sometimes forget the people who held the line in silence, who returned home, not to parades, but to grocery lists, aching joints, and a world that moved on without them. But some of us remember, and we tell stories like this not just to honor the past, but to remind the present. That man in the pharmacy, he might live on your block. He might be the one holding the door open with a shaky hand, the one fixing old radios, walking the same route each morning, nodding quietly but never sharing much. And maybe, just maybe, he's carried something that changed the world. So before we judge what we don't understand, before we dismiss someone because they don't look like much, let's pause. Let's ask ourselves, who are the Ghost Fives still walking among us? What stories have we missed, simply because we never stopped long enough to listen? If this story stirred something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever met someone who seemed ordinary until they weren't? Do you believe some legacies are meant to stay hidden? Should we always celebrate our heroes? Or is there value in letting some sacrifices stay in the shadows? Your perspective matters more than you think. And to those of you who served, whether in uniform or at home, in war or in waiting, thank you. You are never invisible here. If you found meaning in this story, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a quiet reminder that courage still exists, even when no one's watching. And just before you go, a week after Ghost 5's burial, an encrypted signal flashed for 1.3 seconds across a decommissioned naval satellite. The only readable content: operator verified, G5, mission ongoing. Was it a glitch? Or was it a whisper from someone who was never supposed to return? You tell us, we'll be listening. Always.